It was March 12, 1968. The control room of the Soviet Project 667A Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine K-140 was a cramped steel tube lit by red battle lights and filled with the constant hum of ventilation fans pushing recycled air through filters that always smelled faintly of diesel fuel and human sweat. Captain First Rank Victor Digallo stood behind his navigator, one hand gripping the periscope stand, the other holding a ceramic cup of lukewarm tea. The depth gauge read 120 meters. The speed indicator showed 8 knots. They were 300 kilometers east of Newfoundland, deep in the North Atlantic, heading southwest toward their patrol station off the eastern seaboard of the United States. Digallo was a veteran submariner, a man who had spent more time underwater than most men spend at home. His boat carried 16 R-27Z ballistic missiles, each tipped with a megaton-class nuclear warhead. His mission was simple and terrifying: stay hidden, stay quiet, and wait for the order that would end the world. The submarine's rubber-coated anechoic tiles were supposed to absorb active sonar pings. Its 7-bladed propeller was designed to reduce cavitation noise. Every piece of machinery inside was mounted on rubber shock absorbers to dampen vibration. K-140 was, by Soviet standards, a masterpiece of stealth. The sonar operator, a young Michman named Petrov, sat at his passive sonar console, headphones clamped over his ears, listening to the acoustic signature of the ocean. He heard the biological, the clicks and groans of whales, the crackling of shrimp. He heard distant merchant traffic, the thrum of diesels and the churn of propellers crossing overhead lanes far to the south. What he did not hear was any sign of American pursuit. No destroyer sonar pings. No aircraft sonobuoys. Nothing. "Captain," Petrov reported, his voice steady. "Acoustic environment is clear. No contacts." Digallo nodded. This was the third patrol for K-140. They had made the Atlantic crossing before. They knew the drill. The Americans had destroyers and patrol aircraft, but the ocean was vast, and a submarine moving slowly at depth was nearly impossible to find. Soviet naval intelligence had assured them. American anti-submarine warfare doctrine relied on active sonar, on aggressive prosecution of known contacts. If you were careful, if you stayed deep and quiet, you were invisible. What Captain Digallo did not know, what no Soviet submarine commander in the North Atlantic knew in 1968, was that at that very moment his submarine's exact position, course, and speed were being displayed on a paper chart inside a windowless concrete bunker 3,000 kilometers away on the island of Bermuda. The Americans were not hunting K-140. They were simply watching it. They had been watching it since the moment it left the Kola Peninsula. They knew where it was. They knew where it was going. And they knew exactly what it sounded like. The system that was tracking K-140 was called SOS, the Sound Surveillance System. It was a network of underwater hydrophone arrays connected by thousands of kilometers of undersea cable to shore stations, where teams of analysts listened to the entire ocean. It was not a weapon. It was an ear. An ear so sensitive, so vast, and so secret that the Soviet Union would not fully understand its existence for another 2 decades. SOSUS was the single greatest intelligence asymmetry of the Cold War. It was the reason the Soviet submarine force, for all its size and ferocity, never achieved the strategic surprise it believed it possessed. If you genuinely enjoy carefully researched stories about the hidden technologies that shaped the Cold War, you're welcome to subscribe to this channel. But only if this is truly the kind of work you value. This story is not about a battle. It is about a revelation. It is the story of how the Soviet Union spent 40 years building a submarine fleet designed to be invisible, while the United States quietly built a system that made invisibility impossible. It is the story of how confidence, born from secrecy and validated by silence, became the most dangerous illusion in naval history. Chapter 2. The Worldview, the Soviet Submarine Doctrine and the Western Fear. To understand why SOSUS was both necessary and revolutionary, you must first understand the stakes. The Soviet submarine force was not just a military asset. It was the centerpiece of their naval strategy, the steel fist hidden beneath the waves, and in the paranoid strategic calculus of the 1950s and 1960s, it represented an existential threat to the survival of the West. The Red Banner Northern Fleet, headquartered at Severomorsk on the Kola Peninsula, was home to the largest concentration of submarines in the world. By 1970, the Soviet Navy operated over 350 submarines, including over 60 nuclear-powered boats. These were divided into 2 categories, each with its own apocalyptic mission. The first category was the SSBNs, ballistic missile submarines. These boats, starting with the crude Hotel class and evolving into the sleek Yankee class, and later the massive Delta and Typhoon classes, carried submarine-launched ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. Their job was to hide in the deep ocean basins and, if the order came, to launch a devastating second strike attack on American cities. The second category was the attack submarine force, the SSNs and the diesel-electric SSKs. These boats, typified by the November class, Victor class, and Alpha class nuclear submarines, and the older Foxtrot and Whiskey class diesel boats, had a different mission. In the event of war, they were to deploy into the Atlantic in a massive coordinated surge and strangle the NATO alliance by severing the transatlantic supply line. This was not theoretical. NATO war plans assumed that in any major European conflict, the Soviet Union would launch a ground offensive through the Fulda Gap in Germany, while simultaneously deploying hundreds of submarines to attack the convoys carrying American troops, equipment, and supplies across the Atlantic. The Soviet plan, rooted in their experience in World War II, when German U-boats nearly starved Britain into submission, was to create a second Battle of the Atlantic. American planners called this nightmare scenario the Slock War, the Sea Lines of Communication War. If the Soviets could sink enough cargo ships and troop ships, NATO's defense of Europe would collapse in weeks. The math was brutal. The United States needed to move 10 divisions and millions of tons of supplies across the Atlantic in the first 30 days of a war. Even a modest interdiction rate, say 10% of the convoys sunk, would cripple NATO's ability to reinforce Europe. If the Soviets could achieve a 20 or 30% loss rate, the war would be over before the tanks even reached the German border. The Soviets believed they could do this. Their submarines were designed for exactly this kind of coordinated mass attack. They trained for it relentlessly. Soviet doctrine called for submarines to operate in wolf packs, coordinated groups of boats that would converge on convoy lanes, overwhelm the escorts with numbers, and tear the convoys apart. They had studied the German U-boat campaigns of World War II and believed they had perfected the tactics. Western naval planners were terrified. In 1960, the U.S. Navy estimated that in the opening days of a major war, the Soviet submarine force could deploy over 200 boats into the Atlantic. NATO had perhaps 40 anti-submarine warfare ships and a few dozen patrol aircraft. The odds were catastrophic. Admiral Arleigh Burke, the chief of naval operations in the late 1950s, grimly told Congress that if the Soviets chose to deploy their entire submarine force, we would not be able to find them all. The problem was not just numbers, it was geography. Soviet submarines had two primary routes into the Atlantic: the GIUK Gap, the stretch of ocean between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, and the wider expanse of the Norwegian Sea. These were choke points, but they were hundreds of kilometers wide, deep, and turbulent. A submarine moving quietly at depth in the GIUK Gap was like a single needle in a field of haystacks. Active sonar had limited range in the noisy, thermally complex waters of the North Atlantic. Aircraft could drop sonobuoys, but they could only cover small patches of ocean for short periods of time. The Soviet submariners knew this. They were confident in their stealth. They trained in strict noise discipline. They practiced evading sonar. Their tactics manuals emphasized patience, quietness, and the knowledge that the ocean was their ally. Soviet commanders believed that once they cleared the GIUK Gap and dispersed into the open Atlantic, they would be effectively invisible. This confidence was not baseless. In the 1950s, it was rooted in reality. The ocean was vast, and the technology to track a quiet submarine over long distances simply did not exist. Active sonar required a ship or aircraft to be within a few kilometers of the target. Passive sonar, which listened for the noise a submarine made, was limited by the physics of sound propagation in water and by the sheer volume of background noise in the ocean. But the Americans had a problem that demanded a solution. They could not afford to wait until war broke out to find the submarines. By then, it would be too late. They needed a way to track Soviet submarines in peacetime, to know where they were at all times, to understand their patrol patterns, their capabilities, and their vulnerabilities. They needed, in effect, a tripwire across the entire North Atlantic. They needed to turn the ocean itself into a sensor. This was the problem that gave birth to SOSUS, and solving it would require rethinking everything anyone knew about underwater surveillance. Chapter 3. The Problem: The Physics of Silence and the Impossibility of Ocean Surveillance. The challenge of tracking submarines in the open ocean is rooted in the fundamental physics of sound in water. Unlike radar, which uses electromagnetic waves and works beautifully in air, sonar uses sound waves because light and radio waves are absorbed almost instantly by seawater. Sound, by contrast, can travel for hundreds or even thousands of kilometers underwater under the right conditions. But it does not travel in straight lines, and it does not behave predictably. Water is not uniform. It has layers. Temperature, salinity, and pressure all affect the speed of sound. In the ocean, colder water is denser, and sound travels more slowly through it. This creates acoustic layers where sound waves bend, refract, and sometimes become trapped in what acousticians call sound channels. The most famous of these is the deep sound channel, also called the SOFAR channel. Sound fixing and ranging, a layer of water at a depth of about 800 to 1,200 meters, where sound waves can travel for thousands of kilometers with very little loss of energy. This was known science by the 1940s. During World War II, the U.S. Navy had used SOFAR channels experimentally to locate downed pilots. They would drop a small explosive charge that would detonate underwater. The sound would be trapped in the SOFAR channel and picked up by listening stations hundreds of kilometers away, allowing rescuers to triangulate the pilot's position. But there was a critical problem with applying this to anti-submarine warfare. It required the target to make noise. A downed pilot could drop an explosive. A submarine commander trying to stay hidden would do the exact opposite. Soviet submariners were trained to be as quiet as possible. They would shut down non-essential machinery. They would move slowly to reduce propeller noise and avoid cavitation, the formation of tiny bubbles on the propeller blades that collapse with a distinctive crackling sound. They would use every trick they knew to minimize their acoustic signature. The question that haunted American naval planners in the late 1940s and early 1950s was this: even if a submarine was trying to be quiet, could it ever be truly silent? The answer, it turned out, was no. Every submarine, no matter how carefully designed, made noise. The propeller, even at slow speeds, created turbulence. The reduction gears that connected the turbines or diesel engines to the propeller shaft produced a low-frequency hum. Pumps circulating coolant, air compressors, and the simple vibration of the hull moving through water all contributed to an acoustic signature that could, in theory, be detected. The problem was detecting it over the cacophony of the ocean itself. The sea is not a silent place. Waves breaking on the surface create a constant wash of noise. Rain and wind add their own acoustic clutter. Biological sources, snapping shrimp, whales, dolphins, fill the ocean with clicks, groans, and pulses. Add to this the rumble of distant shipping, the creak of underwater geological activity, and the result is an acoustic environment so noisy that picking out the faint sound of a single submarine seemed impossible. In 1949, a small group of scientists and naval officers at the Office of Naval Research began to explore a radical idea. What if, instead of hunting submarines with ships and aircraft, the Navy could listen to the entire ocean? What if they could build fixed listening posts on the seafloor, positioned in the deep sound channel, and use the physics of sound propagation to their advantage? A submarine might be quiet, but it could never be silent. If you could place hydrophones in the right locations and filter out the noise, you could hear a submarine from hundreds of kilometers away. This was the seed of SOSUS. But in 1949, it was an idea that bordered on science fiction. The technology to build and deploy such a system did not exist. Undersea cables would have to be laid across thousands of kilometers of ocean floor. Hydrophones would have to be sensitive enough to detect faint sounds but rugged enough to survive the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. Shore stations would need to process vast amounts of acoustic data in real time. And all of this would have to be done in absolute secrecy. Because if the Soviets knew the system existed, they could design their submarines to evade it, or, worse, they could destroy the arrays in the opening hours of a war. The project was classified at the highest levels. Its existence was known only to a small circle of Navy officers, intelligence officials, and a handful of civilian contractors. The program office was tucked away inside the Naval Facilities Engineering Command, an organization whose public mission was building and maintaining Navy bases. The cover story was perfect. Undersea cables and hydrophones could easily be explained as oceanographic research equipment. The first test installation was built in 1951 off Eleuthera in the Bahamas. It was a small array of hydrophones connected to a shore station by a single cable. The initial results were stunning. The system could detect submarines transiting the area at ranges of over 100 kilometers. Noises that would have been lost in the clutter at shorter ranges were clearly audible when the hydrophones were positioned in the SOFAR channel. Propeller noise, the hum of reduction gears, even the cavitation from high-speed maneuvering, all of it could be heard and identified. This was the breakthrough. It proved that passive acoustic surveillance of the ocean was not just theoretically possible, it was practical. Within 2 years, the Navy had approved Project Caesar, the construction of a full-scale SOSUS installation in the North Atlantic. The first operational arrays went live in 1954, stretching across the GIUK Gap like an invisible fence. By 1958, the system had expanded to cover the Atlantic approaches to North America, but in the Soviet Union, there was no equivalent revelation. Soviet naval intelligence knew the Americans were experimenting with undersea listening devices, but they believed these were tactical systems, short-range hydrophones deployed by individual ships or aircraft for localized anti-submarine operations. The idea that the Americans could build a permanent ocean-spanning surveillance network seemed absurd. It would be too expensive. It would be too complex. And even if it were built, it could not possibly work. The ocean was too big. Submarines were too quiet. This miscalculation, this failure to imagine what was possible, would define Soviet submarine operations for the next 30 years. They were confident in their stealth. They trained their crews to be silent, and they never realized that silence in the deep sound channel was an illusion. Chapter 4. The Misread. Why Soviet intelligence dismissed the threat. The Soviet Union was not blind. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Soviet naval intelligence, the GRU's Naval Directorate, collected extensive information on American anti-submarine warfare programs. They had agents inside NATO. They monitored Western naval exercises. They analyzed captured or acquired American sonar equipment. They knew the United States was investing heavily in ASW technology. But every piece of intelligence they gathered led them to the same conclusion. The American systems were tactical, localized, and ultimately, the Soviet analysis was not stupid. It was based on their own experience and their understanding of sonar physics. They knew that active sonar had fundamental range limitations. A surface ship using active sonar could detect a submarine at perhaps 10 to 20 kilometers under ideal conditions, far less in the noisy, thermally complex waters of the North Atlantic. Passive sonar, which simply listened for submarine noise, was even more limited because it depended entirely on the target making enough noise to be heard over the background clutter. Soviet submarine designers took this seriously. Beginning in the 1950s, they implemented noise reduction measures across their fleet. Propellers were carefully machined to reduce cavitation. Machinery was mounted on rubber shock absorbers. Anechoic tiles, thick rubber coatings designed to absorb sonar pings, were applied to hulls. By the early 1960s, the newest Soviet submarines, like the Victor-class SSN, were significantly quieter than their predecessors. Soviet submarine doctrine reinforced this confidence. Commanders were trained to operate in strict, quiet mode when transiting through areas where American ASW forces might be present. This meant running at slow speeds, typically 5 to 8 knots, shutting down all non-essential machinery and minimizing depth changes. In quiet mode, Soviet submariners believed they were effectively undetectable at ranges beyond a few kilometers. The GRU's assessment of SOSUS, when they finally became aware of its existence in the late 1950s, was shaped by this doctrinal confidence. Western technical journals and naval publications occasionally mentioned fixed acoustic surveillance systems or ocean surveillance networks, but these references were vague and heavily classified. Soviet analysts pieced together what they could. They knew the Americans had laid undersea cables in the North Atlantic. They knew these cables were connected to shore installations, some of which were identified as naval facility stations. But the GRU concluded that these installations were part of a localized barrier system, similar in concept to the defensive sonar nets the Soviets themselves had experimented with in the Baltic and Black Seas. These were seen as tactical choke point defenses, useful for monitoring narrow passages but not capable of ocean-wide surveillance. The idea that hydrophones on the seafloor could detect submarines at ranges of hundreds of kilometers seemed physically implausible to Soviet analysts. They calculated that the background noise of the ocean, combined with the acoustic absorption and scattering caused by thermal layers, would make long-range detection impossible. There was a deeper psychological factor at work. Soviet submariners trusted their own silence. In their training exercises, Soviet submarines routinely evaded their own surface ASW forces. In war games in the Barents Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk, diesel boats operating in quiet mode would slip past destroyer patrols without being detected. This empirical evidence, submarines evading detection in controlled exercises, reinforced the belief that stealth worked. What the Soviet Navy did not know was that their own exercises were not comparable to the Atlantic environment. The Barents Sea is relatively shallow, acoustically complex, and filled with pack ice that creates immense background noise. The Sea of Okhotsk is even worse, a noisy, shallow basin where sound propagation is chaotic. In these environments, passive sonar range was indeed limited. But the North Atlantic, with its deep sound channels and relatively stable acoustic conditions, was a different world entirely. Soviet intelligence also missed the scale of the American investment. Between 1954 and 1970, the U.S. Navy spent over $3 billion, equivalent to roughly $25 billion today, on SOSUS construction, maintenance, and upgrades. This was an industrial program on the scale of the Manhattan Project, involving thousands of personnel, dozens of shore stations, and tens of thousands of kilometers of undersea cable. The cables alone, manufactured by AT&T's Western Electric Division, were engineering marvels, armored, pressure-resistant, and capable of transmitting analog acoustic data with minimal loss over distances of over 1,000 kilometers. But because SOSUS was so highly classified, the Soviets never saw the full picture. They saw pieces of cable here, a shore installation there, but they could not imagine the integrated whole. Soviet military culture, shaped by decades of secrecy and compartmentalization, assumed the Americans operated the same way. They assumed that if SOSUS existed, it was fragmented, uncoordinated, and limited to specific choke points. The most critical intelligence failure was conceptual. Soviet doctrine emphasized mobility and mass. They believed that the key to naval power was having more submarines than the enemy could track. If the Americans had to find and track each submarine individually using ships and aircraft, the Soviets would overwhelm them through sheer numbers. SOSUS, in this framework, seemed irrelevant. Even if the Americans could detect a submarine transiting the GIUK Gap, so what? There were dozens of submarines. The Americans couldn't stop them all. What the Soviets did not understand, what they could not imagine, was that SOSUS was not designed to stop submarines. It was designed to know they were there. It was an intelligence system, not a weapon. Its purpose was to track Soviet submarines in peacetime, to catalog their acoustic signatures, to map their patrol routes, and to feed this information to attack submarines and ASW aircraft that could then intercept them. SOSUS turned the invisible Soviet submarine fleet into a visible, trackable, and ultimately vulnerable force. The dismissal was complete by the mid-1960s. Soviet submarine commanders were confident. Soviet naval intelligence was confident. And this confidence was never seriously challenged because the Americans never revealed what they knew. SOSUS detections were so tightly classified that even the crews of U.S. attack submarines that used SOSUS data to trail Soviet boats were often not told how the target had been initially located. The secret held. And so, for nearly 3 decades, Soviet submarines sailed into the Atlantic thinking they were ghosts. They were, in fact, being watched every step of the way. Chapter 5: The Hidden Strength: How SOSUS Turned Physics into Intelligence. The genius of SOSUS lay not in any single technological breakthrough, but in the integration of sound physics, engineering, and operational discipline into a system that could listen to an entire ocean. The heart of SOSUS was the hydrophone array. These were not single microphones, but carefully designed clusters of dozens or even hundreds of individual hydrophones, each a piezoelectric sensor capable of converting pressure waves, sound, into electrical signals. The arrays were deployed on the seafloor at depths ranging from 500 to 2,000 meters, positioned to sit within or just above the deep sound channel where acoustic propagation was most efficient. Each array was connected to a shore station by an undersea cable. These cables, laid by specialized cable ships like the USNS Zeus, were technological marvels. They were armored against fishing trawlers and undersea landslides, insulated to prevent electrical interference, and designed to carry analog signals over distances of 1,000 kilometers or more with minimal degradation. At the shore station, the signals from each hydrophone were routed to banks of analog filters and amplifiers. The shore stations themselves were windowless bunkers, typically built on remote coastlines or islands. The first major Atlantic station was Naval Facility Bermuda, which went operational in 1954. Others followed: Argentia in Newfoundland, Keflavik in Iceland, Brodie in Wales. Each station was manned by teams of specially trained sonar technicians, enlisted sailors who spent their shifts wearing headphones, staring at waterfall displays and listening to the ocean. This was not automated. In the 1950s and 1960s, computers were room-sized machines incapable of real-time acoustic analysis. SOSUS relied on the human ear and human judgment. Sonar technicians learned to distinguish biological noise from mechanical noise. They memorized the acoustic signatures of merchant ships, fishing trawlers, and naval vessels. And they learned the unmistakable sound of a submarine, a low-frequency tonal hum from reduction gears, the rhythmic swish of a propeller, the occasional clank of a hatch or valve. When a technician detected a submarine, he would mark the bearing on a large plotting board and call it in to the station's operations center. If multiple arrays detected the same target, the operations center could triangulate its position. This process, called crossfix, was startlingly accurate. With 2 or 3 arrays detecting the same submarine, SOSUS could localize a target to within a few square kilometers from ranges of over 500 kilometers. But detection was only the first step. The real power of SOSUS lay in its operational integration with the broader USDA, anti-submarine warfare network. When a Soviet submarine was detected transiting the GIUK Gap, SOSUS would provide an initial localization. This information would be relayed, via encrypted teletype, to the Undersea Warfare Operations Center at the headquarters of the Atlantic Fleet in Norfolk, Virginia. From there, the information would be passed to operational units, attack submarines on patrol, P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft, or surface ASW groups. The attack submarines were the most effective hunters. A U.S. PATH, Navy SSN, like the Sturgeon class or later the Los Angeles class, would be vectored to the last known position of the Soviet submarine. Once in the area, the American boat would use its own passive sonar, far more sensitive than any surface ships, to reacquire the target. Then it would trail the Soviet submarine, sometimes for days or even weeks, recording its acoustic signature, observing its maneuvers, and gathering intelligence on its patrol patterns. These trailing operations were extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily valuable. American submariners operated under strict rules of engagement that prioritized stealth over aggression. They stayed far enough behind the Soviet boat to avoid detection but close enough to maintain contact. In some cases, U.S. submarines would trail Soviet SSBNs all the way to their patrol stations, mapping their routes and confirming that, in the event of war, American attack boats could find and destroy them before they launched their missiles. The Soviets knew they were sometimes being followed. Soviet sonar operators occasionally detected the faint acoustic signature of a trailing submarine, but they assumed these were chance encounters, random contacts in a vast ocean. They did not realize that the initial detection had come from SOS, hundreds of kilometers away. They did not understand that the American boats were not hunting blindly. They were being handed targets on a silver platter. SOSUS also provided strategic warning. Soviet submarines did not deploy individually, they surged. In the event of rising tensions or a crisis, the Soviet Navy would send multiple submarines through the GIUK Gap over a period of days or weeks. SOSUS detected these surges in real time, giving American intelligence a critical window into Soviet operational readiness. If submarine activity suddenly increased, it might signal preparations for war. SOSUS became an early warning system, a strategic tripwire. By the late 1960s, SOSUS coverage had expanded dramatically. New arrays were installed along the east coast of the United States, covering the approaches to major ports. Additional systems were built in the Pacific, covering the Sea of Japan and the choke points between the Soviet Pacific Fleet bases at Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk, and the open ocean. A separate system, called SOS PAC-BAR, Pacific Barrier, monitored the waters around Hawaii and Guam. The system was not perfect. In the noisy, shallow waters of the Barents Sea, SOSUS arrays had limited effectiveness. Soviet submarines operating close to their home bases in the Kola Peninsula or the Sea of Okhotsk were harder to detect. SOSUS also struggled with the newest Soviet submarines, particularly the Victor III class introduced in the mid-1970s, which were significantly quieter than earlier boats. But, in the deep Atlantic, SOSUS was devastatingly effective. By 1970, U.S. Navy analysts estimated that SOS detected over 80% of Soviet submarines transiting the GIUK Gap. In some years, the detection rate approached 100%. This was not a tactical advantage. This was total acoustic dominance. And the Soviets still did not realize it. They continued to believe in their stealth. They continued to train their crews for silent running. They continued to send submarines into the Atlantic, confident that they were invisible. The system that watched them was so secret, so carefully guarded, that even when Soviet intelligence obtained fragments of information about SOS, they dismissed it as exaggeration or disinformation. The hidden strength was not just the technology. It was the patience. The Americans never acted on SOSUS detections in ways that would reveal the system's existence. They never sank a Soviet submarine in peacetime. They never confronted Soviet commanders with evidence of their own tracks. They simply watched and listened and waited. Chapter 6. The Proof. The Cold War's quietest battlefield, the proof of SOSUS's effectiveness was not a single battle or crisis. It was a decades-long accumulation of intelligence that reshaped the balance of power beneath the waves. The evidence emerged slowly, in fragments, often in ways the Soviets did not immediately understand. One of the earliest public hints of SOSUS's capability came in 1968, though the context was tragic. On May 21, 1968, the U.S. Navy's nuclear-powered attack submarine, USS Scorpion, failed to return to port at Norfolk, Virginia. The boat, a Skipjack-class SSN returning from a Mediterranean deployment, had simply vanished. Search efforts were launched, but the Atlantic is vast, and without a last known position, finding a sunken submarine seemed hopeless. What the public did not know was that SOSUS had heard Scorpion's death. Acoustic analysts at Naval Facility Argentia in Newfoundland had detected a series of anomalous sounds on May 22, sounds consistent with a submarine imploding at depth and the subsequent collapse of internal compartments. By analyzing the timing of the sounds received at multiple SOSUS arrays, Navy analysts were able to triangulate Scorpion's final position to a small area of seafloor approximately 400 miles southwest of the Azores. A deep-sea search was launched using the submersible TRIES-2. On October 30, 1968, Scorpion's wreckage was located on the seafloor at a depth of over 3,000 meters, almost exactly where SOS had predicted. The Navy carefully avoided publicizing how it had narrowed the search area. In official statements, credit was given to acoustic analysis and oceanographic data, but the existence of SOSUS remained classified. Soviet naval intelligence took note of the incident, but they focused on the loss of the American submarine, not on the method used to find it. Throughout the 1970s, SOSUS provided a strategic intelligence advantage that was invisible to the Soviets but critical to American war planning. Every Soviet submarine that transited the GIUK Gap was detected, tracked, and catalogued. The acoustic signature of each boat, the unique sound fingerprint created by its propeller, reduction gears, and auxiliary machinery, was recorded and stored in a classified database maintained by the Navy's Undersea Warfare Center. This database became a library of Soviet submarine acoustics. Analysts could identify individual submarines by their sound signatures alone. They knew that the faint, high-pitched whine at 157 Hz was unique to the reduction gears of Victor 1 hull number K.9.147. They knew that the distinctive low-frequency rumble at 48 Hz was characteristic of Yankee-class SSBNs with slightly misaligned propeller shafts. This level of detail allowed American attack submarines to positively identify and trail specific Soviet boats, even in areas where multiple submarines were operating. The intelligence gathered from SOSUS and the trailing operations it enabled was staggering. American submariners learned the patrol patterns of Soviet SSBNs, the bastions where they hid under the Arctic ice, and the operating procedures they followed. They learned how Soviet submarines communicated with shore commands using extremely low-frequency ELF radio transmissions. They learned the endurance limits of Soviet boats, their refueling schedules, and even the psychological stresses on their crews during long deployments. But the most important thing SOSUS revealed was a vulnerability the Soviets had never anticipated. Soviet SSBNs, the submarines that carried the nuclear missiles meant to ensure a retaliatory strike, were not invulnerable sanctuaries. They were trackable. In a crisis, American attack submarines could shatter them, and in a war, they could be destroyed before they launched their missiles. The credibility of the Soviet second strike deterrent was quietly being undermined. The Soviets began to suspect something was wrong in the mid-1970s, but they could not pinpoint the problem. Soviet submarines returning from Atlantic patrols reported a troubling pattern. They were being trailed by American SSNs far more often than random chance would predict. Sometimes the American boats would appear within hours of a Soviet submarine entering the Atlantic. Sometimes they would follow for days, staying just at the edge of sonar detection range, like wolves tracking prey. Soviet naval intelligence investigated. They reviewed operational procedures. They looked for security leaks, suspecting that agents inside the Soviet Navy were feeding information to the Americans. They found nothing. The only explanation was that the Americans had some form of long-range detection capability, but what it was and how it worked remained a mystery. The first hard evidence of SOSUS came from an unexpected source, a disgruntled American sailor. In 1975, John Anthony Walker, a U.S. Navy warrant officer and communications specialist, began selling secrets to the Soviet KGB. Walker's espionage ring provided the Soviets with encryption keys and operational information, but in 1982, one of his associates provided the Soviets with a document that explicitly described SOSUS capabilities and array locations. The information was stunning and horrifying. The Soviets learned that SOSUS arrays covered not just the GIUK Gap, but also the Strait of Gibraltar, the waters off the U.S. Passage, East Coast, and critical choke points in the Pacific. They learned that SOSUS detection ranges exceeded 500 kilometers under ideal conditions. They learned that every major Soviet submarine transit for the past 20 years had been detected and tracked. The Soviet response was immediate and desperate. Submarine commanders were ordered to alter their transit routes, hugging coastlines and shallow waters where SOS was less effective. New noise reduction programs were accelerated. The Soviet Navy invested billions of rubles into developing the Akula-class SSN, a submarine designed from the keel up to be as quiet as the best American boats. Soviet engineers studied captured or acquired Western propeller designs and anechoic coatings, trying to close the acoustic gap, but it was too late. By the mid-1980s, the strategic damage was irreversible. American attack submarines had spent over a decade trailing Soviet SSBNs, learning their every operational habit. The acoustic database was comprehensive, and even as Soviet submarines became quieter, SOSUS was being upgraded with digital signal processing, towed arrays, and integration with space-based surveillance systems. The final, crushing proof came not in war, but in the Cold War's endgame. In 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, Russian naval officers privately acknowledged to their American counterparts what they had long suspected but never confirmed: that Soviet submarines in the Atlantic had never been truly invisible, that SOSUS had tracked them for decades, and that the entire Soviet submarine strategy had been built on an illusion of stealth that did not exist. The quietest battlefield of the Cold War had never been fought with torpedoes or depth charges. It had been fought with patience, with technology, and with the simple, devastating power of listening. Chapter 7. Conclusion. The scoreboard and the permanent change, the final accounting of SOSUS is not measured in battles fought or submarines sunk. It is measured in the wars that never happened and the strategies that became obsolete. For over 3 decades, from the mid-1950s to the end of the Cold War, SOSUS provided the United States and NATO with an intelligence advantage of staggering proportions. During that time, Soviet submarines transited the Atlantic thousands of times. SOSUS detected and tracked the vast majority of those transits. American attack submarines used that information to trail Soviet boats, gather intelligence, and practice the very tactics they would have used if war had come. The Soviets never achieved the strategic surprise they believed their submarine force possessed. The statistics declassified in the decades since the Cold War are unambiguous. Between 1960 and 1985, SOSUS detected over 13,000 Soviet submarine transits through monitored choke points. Of those, an estimated 70 to 90% were positively identified by class, and in many cases by individual hull. U.S. Navy attack submarines conducted over 1,500 close trailing operations against Soviet boats, some lasting weeks or even months. The acoustic intelligence gathered filled libraries of data that informed everything from torpedo design to war plans. The strategic impact was profound. SOSUS undermined the credibility of the Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missile force as a secure second strike deterrent. If American attack submarines could shadow Soviet SSBNs during peacetime, they could hunt and destroy them in wartime. This reality forced the Soviet Navy to divert resources into protecting their missile boats, deploying attack submarines to escort them, creating heavily defended bastions under the Arctic ice. Resources that might otherwise have been used for offensive operations against NATO convoys. SOSUS also changed the nature of ASW itself. Before SOS, anti-submarine warfare was reactive, searching for submarines after they were detected by chance. SOSUS made ASSW proactive. It provided early warning, strategic cueing, and continuous tracking. It transformed the ocean from an impenetrable hiding place into a surveilled environment. The legacy of SOSUS extends beyond the Cold War. The system, in upgraded forms, remains operational today. Modern arrays use fiber optic cables instead of copper, digital signal processing instead of analog filters, and automated detection algorithms instead of human operators wearing headphones. But the fundamental principle, using the ocean itself as a sensor, remains unchanged. The lessons of SOSUS are stark. The Soviet Union invested enormous resources into building a submarine force designed for stealth. They trained their crews rigorously. They developed sophisticated noise reduction technologies. They built submarines that by the 1980s were nearly as quiet as their American counterparts. But they did so while laboring under a fatal illusion, the belief that the ocean was vast enough to hide them. The Americans, by contrast, understood that stealth is not binary. A submarine is not either invisible or visible. It is a source of sound moving through a medium that transmits sound over vast distances. The question was never whether submarines could be detected. The question was whether the technology existed to detect them at operationally useful ranges, and whether that detection could be kept secret long enough to matter. The tech dog, SOSUS, answered both questions with a resounding yes. The confidence that Captain Digelow felt aboard K-140 in March 1968. The confidence that he was invisible, that his boat was silent, that the Americans could not find him, was not just mistaken. It was an illusion carefully nurtured by American operational security. The Americans never revealed what they knew. They never confronted Soviet submarines in ways that would expose SOSUS's existence. They simply watched and listened and accumulated knowledge. This patience was its own form of strategic brilliance. If the Soviets had known about SOSUS earlier, they could have adapted. They could have designed countermeasures. They could have changed their tactics. But by the time they understood what they were facing, the Cold War was nearly over. The story of SOSUS is, in the end, a story about the power of information. It is a reminder that in warfare, as in intelligence, the greatest advantage is not always the weapon that destroys, but the sensor that reveals. The Soviets built submarines to be invisible. The Americans built a system that made invisibility impossible. And for 40 years, one side knew a secret the other side never imagined, that in the deep Atlantic, there were no hiding places, only the illusion of silence.